I can
Okay.
translate for you. Yes.
Okay, I was looking for it at the same time.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, so today I want to talk about the case of Fonio, and this is a case I've been championing, as you heard in my presentation. I'm from Senegal, and I felt like this was important to introduce a crop that grows in my region, and it's a type of crop that's underutilized. It's a type of millet, actually. It grows in the Sahel. It's drought resistant. It's quite resilient. It's believed to be the oldest cultivated grain in Africa, and for some reason, Fonio is not mainstream. So as a chef, it became a mission for me to introduce it. And you can go to the next slide. I'll talk to you about my approach to introducing it. It's a grain that grows in an area called Kédougou in Senegal. And in cities like Dakar, where I grew up, it's even hard to find fonio, even though it's a easy grain to grow because it not only drought resistant, but it also restores the soil, which is very important. It restores the soil, it regenerates it because it has deep roots that add nutrients to it. And the farmers that grow it are among the poorest one in the world. So my thinking was, if I can make access to this grain, if I can make it accessible to markets around the world, that could bring economic opportunities for those regions. It could be a model of development. So you can go to the next slide and we can talk more about it. So you see the size of fonio, it's a tiny little grain. This is how it looks like in the finger. It looks like couscous. And that's the challenge, because it's not only it's easy to grow, but it's difficult to process to turn it into food. You have to remove that tiny skin that's inedible. Move on to the next slide. And when you remove the tiny skin, that's what it looks like. It's a tiny, fluffy, couscous-looking grain that separates, and you have different ways of cooking it. It cooks in 5 minutes. It's quite easy to cook, and it's very versatile. So the next slide, please. So what I first started was just starting to do research on the way of cooking it. And as you can see here, you have all these different pictures of fonio. Some are traditional, some are imagined. So I wrote a whole cookbook on fonio, and this book is just taking you to the journey of fonio from the processing all the way to the table. And you can see even sushi made out of fonio, inspired by Japanese, but with the ingredients that are African. So you have okra and sweet potato in this fonio sushi, and a dipping sauce that has palm oil inspired dipping sauce. In the middle, this is a beet and fonio a salad with like spicy pickled carrots. In the left side, this is a dish inspired by our traditional peanut sauce with roasted lamb with asparagus, but with a peanut sauce and fonio. So I'm just having fun with fonio. There's different ways of cooking it. You can go different. Next slide too. You see more fonio applications. Some are desserts, fonio coconut and chocolate pudding with raspberries, and you also have for breakfast fonio pudding as well. You have different ways of doing it. One with coconut, one with plain fonio. There's a saying in the Bambara that fonio never embarrasses the cook. So there's so many ways of using it. And take on next slide. So to get to a market, I realized that one thing we had to do was to create a brand and to make these grain, to tell the story of this grain so that the consumer could understand and be connected to it. So we started Yolele. Yolele is the African brand that has a vision of being a brand of reference for African crops, not only fonio. Fonio is just our Trojan horse to get to the market, but there's so many other underutilized crops that need to be introduced to the market. And what we did with fonio, it was to introduce it to a market, but to have a proof of concept to show that there is a way to present it to a market that didn't know what fonio was. And within like the past 6 years, we were able to have a distribution across the US. You can go to the next slide. And we've created brands that show the story in the packaging so that it can be competitive, So we started with one Whole Foods supermarket in next to my restaurant in Harlem in New York City. And today we are distributed across the US in all the Whole Foods. For those who don't know, for Whole Foods is the largest natural supermarket in the US. But we also distribute it at Target, at Sprouts, at most of the major supermarkets across the US. So we have created the demand with one ingredient, the one that you see on the left, that was the fonio grain. But then eventually we started to add fonio pilafs, also inspired by West African tradition. This one, the yellow one you have, is the fonio yassa. But we have the jollof, we have the afro-funk, which is made with the dawa dawa, fermented locust bean that you see throughout West Africa. And we even now entered the snack category with our fonio chips. We have different flavored fonio chips. The one you have here is the greens and moringa and baobab. And we also have the afro-funk again. We have a few other plain sea salt. We have the yassa as well, which is yassa is a dish from Senegal. It's onion and lime and chili. So just to show you the possibilities are various. We have different ways of tackling the market, going towards the consumer. The challenge here was to create a demand so that we can go there and now return to the processing and improve the processing. You can go to the next slide. So these are also the different chips that I was talking to you about. So just the chips is interesting because that's a fast-moving category. Now you are talking to consumers who are not particularly interested in cooking or too intimidated at using a new ingredient. Then you giving them access to it by just giving a product that they can easily snack on, and it's good for them. But fonio is also a nutrition powerhouse. In addition to being gluten-free, it answers many of the challenges that we are facing with our health. It has a low glycemic index. It's protein dense. So it's a grain that that is really satisfying when you consume it. But the other addition is the impact that it's having on the communities that are growing it, bringing economic opportunities, but also on the environment, because the agriculture of fonio tends to restore the soil. So it grows in the poor soil, like I mentioned. So this is how we went from like being a grain that 5 years ago in the US, no one really knew, to today we have distribution, as you can see on the left side, the retail and the food service is growing. You know, we have over 3,000 supermarkets across the US, chains and food services as well. And the recognition we having had some great media attention from, you name it, the CNN, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, etc., etc. So it's been a great journey, but really most exciting is the possibilities from here, is realizing that there is a demand, there is a growing number of consumers who are looking to be introduced to crops that are underutilized, that have been grown in other parts of the world, who are looking to change the food system. This food system has been limiting our diet, our global diet, and to the detriment of our health, because most of our chronic diseases are directly connected to this limited diet, but also to the detriment of our planet is suffering from this limitation, because we are ignoring crops that are resilient, that are better for the planet than and using crops that require so much water or fertilizers, chemical fertilizers. And that's really what we need to do to stop this this trend here, is to really be bold and brand these other crops that have been ignored: millet, sorghum, amaranth. There's so many thousands of others. Fonio is just one example, and this is the way forward for not only our food system but for our own planet. You can move to the next one. Next slide. Is there no slide? I'm not sure if you can hear me. That's the last one. Oh, okay. Sorry. So the next slide, I was gonna go on. We talk about the possibilities now. The way that demand is growing, we really need to make sure the sourcing, the supply follows the demand. And the innovation for us was to make sure we improve on the processing, which was the challenge. The processing of fonio, I mentioned earlier, is difficult because you have to remove the skin. And at this stage of processing, you get to for 1 ton of fonio, you have to get a whole day of processing. That's at the best level. So we figured out that we needed to improve that by building a mill. And this mill, we went to a company called Bueller and asked them to design a mill that will not only improve the velocity of the processing from 1 ton per day to 2 tons per hour. So that's really changed a lot of things here. But in addition, the Fonio post-harvest waste is almost 50%, which is very high. If we want it to be a global crop, grass crop, we needed to also tackle that challenge of the waste. So that meal that we designed with Bueller went from 50% post-harvest waste to single digits post-harvest waste. So the impact here is you having now almost doubling the production of fonio without increasing its agriculture, which is really amazing. So that really is also another thing that we need to consider if we want to bring these underutilized crops into the system, is to really innovate at the processing level. That changes everything. So now that we have a mill that can process it at a much efficient way for the quality, the quantity that's required by international markets, we can imagine creating a network of small farmers, because it needs to be also always going back to the small farmers, making sure the communities benefit from it. This network of small farmers, we're organizing it. We have managed to get a grant from USAID of $2 million to organize a small farmers network and have a system that can grow as the demand grows. That network is contracted by the mill to provide fonio to the mill, and the fonio now is processed and we send it to our growing market for the brand, but also for the other industries, because you also have to integrate other industries into that system. So other industries, just there's so many to imagine, from the big food industries, Nestle's, Mars, Kellogg's, who are all in need of crops like fonio, because they also need to meet their sustainable development goals. These industries, by using crops like fonio, can have even a greater impact that we would have by using even 1%, 2% of fonio into their products. That has an impact because they have a much bigger market. But we also have a new industry that we've been working with recently, for past couple of years actually, is the brewery industry, because breweries, they use grains for their products. So we started with Brooklyn Brewery, and we did a limited edition between Brooklyn Brewery, Yolele, and Whole Foods of a beer that was using fonio. It was a 10% Fonio beer, and that beer was phenomenal. And that limited edition was a hit, to the point where we returned to Senegal and did a documentary with Brooklyn Brewery to show the impact of how the brewery industries would be having by using Fonio into their grains. And this documentary, just 2 weeks ago, I returned from Copenhagen to present it to Carlsberg. And Carlsberg, ahead of this presentation, we sent them Fonio paddies for them to experiment with it. And they played with 100% Fonio beer, which was, to them, tasted like champagne. It wasn't even a beer. They were very impressed by the result of this. So this is very exciting to see that even another industry that we haven't even thought about is now on the path of integrating fonio into their market now. So that's now, the demand is really growing in a way that's like exponential, and the mill is luckily into place now that can be scaled as the demand grows. So I can imagine having another mill. This one is being built in Mali, but another mill could be built in Ghana, in Nigeria, northern Nigeria, in Senegal, in all the fonio region growing of the Sahel. And that way, you can imagine also building it with a network of growing farmers. And that network of farmers is important to not only support the fonio, but not only fonio, because that becomes monoculture again. It's important to support other crops that used to be grown traditionally in the region that are resilient. Some were grown in rotation with fonio, like Bambara groundnut. So we have to imagine also products coming out of those other crops, like Bambara groundnuts, which is an amazing one. It looks like peanuts and tastes like peanuts, but doesn't have the allergens of peanuts. So there's also possibilities that can come out of it. But what most important is to invest in the research on these crops so that they could be added value, and integrating them to the market by branding them properly. So that's basically the story that I wanted to tell, and that's a story of hope for not only our planet, but our small farming communities that are in need of being supported, of being integrated into the market. They know how to grow these things. They've been doing it for thousands of years, but they just don't have access to market. And to me, the solution that we are offering is by branding them properly. But before branding them is to understand these crops by doing the right research on them, and really breaking down the silos and making sure everyone is part of the conversation. Thank you very much.